My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 34 years old, and 16 years ago, my father quietly prepared for my death like it was a financial investment. I didn't understand that back then. At 18, I thought my father was cold because he was stressed about money, because my medical bills were stacking up, because my illness scared him. I had no idea he had secretly taken out a $750,000 life insurance policy on me just months before I collapsed in my high school chemistry class. I had no idea he had already called the insurance company multiple times asking detailed questions about payout timelines and accidental death clauses while I was unconscious in intensive care. And I definitely had no idea that 16 years later, I would become the actuary responsible for exposing one of the largest internal insurance fraud schemes in the Midwest. A scheme that eventually led straight back to my own father. But before I tell you how that happened, you need to understand the kind of household I grew up in. Because people like my father don't suddenly wake up evil one morning. They become dangerous slowly. Through years of selfishness, greed, favoritism, and excuses that everyone around them learns to ignore. We lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a small brick house that looked perfectly normal from the outside. My father, Richard, worked as a finance manager at a regional car dealership. My mother, Denise, worked part-time at a dental clinic, and my younger brother, Caleb, was treated like the center of the universe. Caleb could do absolutely nothing wrong. If he failed a class, teachers were unfair. If he broke something expensive, it was an accident. If he wanted new baseball equipment, somehow money magically appeared. But if I needed anything, even something small, my father treated it like a burden. When I was 14, my grandmother left me a $30,000 education fund before she passed away, and I still remember overhearing my parents argue about it in the kitchen after the funeral. My father actually said, "She's smart enough to get scholarships. Caleb needs more opportunities." That sentence stayed in my head for years because it told me exactly how he viewed me, not as a daughter, as an asset with limited value. By 16, I was working part-time after school while Caleb had private coaching, expensive electronics, and eventually a used Mustang waiting for him before he even got his license. My mother knew things were wrong, but she rarely challenged my father directly. One night while washing dishes, she quietly admitted something I never forgot. She said, "Your father thinks investing in Caleb gives a better return." At 18, I didn't fully understand how disturbing that sentence really was. 16 years later, staring at fraud reports in a federal investigation office, I finally did. My father viewed human beings like financial instruments. Everything was risk versus reward. And apparently, I became worth more to him dead than alive. The illness started during my senior year in early 2010. I began fainting at school, losing weight, and waking up exhausted no matter how much I slept. Doctors eventually diagnosed a severe autoimmune condition attacking my kidneys. I spent weeks going through tests, medications, and hospital visits while my father became strangely obsessed with paperwork instead of my treatment. I would walk into the dining room late at night and see him surrounded by folders he immediately tried to hide whenever I got close. At the time, I assumed he was dealing with debt problems. Looking back now, I know exactly what those papers were: insurance forms, beneficiary records, policy agreements. The night everything changed, I woke up in intensive care around 2 a.m. and overheard my parents whispering near the doorway. My mother was crying softly while my father sounded irritated more than emotional. Then he said something that still makes me sick when I think about it. He said, "Do you understand what this could solve for us?" My mother whispered, "She's our daughter." And my father answered, "And Caleb is our future." I pretended to stay asleep because hearing those words shattered something inside me that never fully healed. A month later, I was discharged from the hospital weak, terrified, and drowning in medical debt while my father barely acknowledged me anymore. He seemed disappointed that I survived. I know that sounds dramatic, but there's no other way to describe it. Around the same time, I discovered my grandmother's college fund had completely disappeared. When I confronted my father, he didn't even bother denying it. He calmly told me they needed the money for family priorities, which apparently meant Caleb's baseball camps and travel tournaments. That was the moment I realized I would never have a future if I stayed in that house. But here's what I didn't know yet. 3 months before my hospitalization, my father had increased my life insurance coverage twice. And according to internal records I would eventually uncover years later, he had already started calculating exactly how much my death would financially benefit him. I left home 2 weeks after graduation with 2 duffel bags, a cheap secondhand laptop, and exactly $211 in my checking account. Nobody tried to stop me. That's the part people never understand when I tell this story. They expect some giant screaming match or dramatic moment at the front door, but toxic families usually don't end with explosions. They end with silence. My mother cried quietly while pretending to fold laundry in the living room. My brother Caleb barely looked up from his phone, and my father sat in his recliner watching a baseball game like I was simply taking out the trash instead of disappearing from his life. Right before I walked out, he said something that stayed in my head for years. He said, "Make sure you leave your key behind." Not, "Be careful." Not, "Call when you get there." Just the key. Like the only thing he cared about was protecting access to the house from someone he already considered disposable. I spent my first night alone in a motel near Interstate 44 that smelled like cigarettes and bleach. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at my bank balance on my phone for nearly an hour because I genuinely had no idea what I was supposed to do next. My illness wasn't fully under control yet. My medical debt was already crushing me, and I had absolutely no safety net left. There were moments that first night when I seriously considered going back home and apologizing for things that weren't even my fault, just so I wouldn't feel so alone anymore. But every time I thought about returning, I remembered my father's voice in that hospital hallway saying, "This could solve things for us." And something inside me refused to let me walk backward. The next 4 years were not inspiring. People love stories where success comes quickly after hardship because it makes suffering feel meaningful. But real life usually isn't that clean. I worked exhausting jobs during the day and studied at night because college was the only escape route I could still see. I waitressed at diners, worked overnight pharmacy shifts, answered phones at a trucking company, and spent one miserable winter scanning legal documents in a freezing warehouse for barely above minimum wage. Some months I had to choose between paying for medication or groceries. There were nights I sat in my car crying from exhaustion before driving to another shift because I physically didn't think I could keep going. But strangely, the worse things became, the more obsessed I became with understanding financial systems. I wanted to know how people manipulated money, how insurance companies calculated risk, how families justified greed, how fraud could hide in plain sight for years without anyone noticing. Numbers started making more sense to me than human beings did because numbers eventually reveal the truth, whether people want them to or not. At 22, I enrolled part-time in community college studying statistics and financial mathematics, and that decision completely changed my life. One professor in particular, Dr. Leonard Weiss, noticed me staying after class constantly asking questions about probability modeling and claims analysis. One evening after everyone else had left, he asked me if I had ever considered actuarial science. I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. I could barely afford rent, and he was talking about one of the hardest professional careers in finance. But he looked at me very seriously and said, "You don't think like most students. You think like someone trying to uncover patterns people miss." That sentence hit me harder than he probably realized because uncovering hidden patterns had basically become my survival instinct growing up around my father. So I started studying actuarial science while juggling 2 jobs and night classes. The exams were brutal. I failed my first certification exam, then failed another one 8 months later, and each failure felt devastating because the exams cost money I didn't really have. Meanwhile, Caleb's life was moving in the exact opposite direction. Through mutual relatives, I heard he had blown out his shoulder during college baseball and dropped out after developing a gambling problem. My father had invested everything in him emotionally and financially, and suddenly his future wasn't producing returns anymore. Funny how quickly people like my father turn bitter when their investments stop paying off. Around that same time, my mother started secretly calling me once every few months. She always sounded nervous, like she was afraid my father would overhear. During one conversation in late 2016, she accidentally revealed something strange. She mentioned that my father had become obsessed with life insurance policies and side financial deals after I moved out. Apparently, he spent years helping desperate people file questionable claims through connections he developed at the dealership. At first, I didn't think much about it because insurance fraud sounded small compared to the bigger mess my family already was. But then she said something else that made my stomach tighten immediately. She said, "After you got sick, your father kept saying insurance companies were easier to manipulate than banks." I remember gripping my phone so hard my hand started shaking because suddenly pieces of the past started rearranging themselves inside my head. The paperwork, the hidden folders, the late-night phone calls, his disappointment after I survived. It all began feeling less like paranoia and more like a pattern. But I still didn't know the worst part yet, because while I was slowly building a career analyzing insurance risk, my father was quietly building an entire fraud operation around stolen identities, fake beneficiaries, and manipulated death claims. And somehow, without realizing it, I was getting closer and closer to becoming the person who would destroy everything he built. By 2019, I finally felt like my life belonged to me again. I had passed 3 actuarial certification exams, secured a full-time position at Midwestern Mutual Insurance in Chicago, and moved into a small apartment overlooking the river on the north side of the city. It wasn't glamorous, but after years of survival mode, it felt unreal to wake up in a place where nobody was screaming, manipulating, or treating me like a burden. For the first time in my life, stability didn't feel temporary. My job focused on claims analysis and fraud detection, specifically identifying statistical irregularities hidden inside large data sets. Most people imagine insurance fraud as something obvious, but the dangerous schemes are usually quiet patterns buried under thousands of legitimate claims. Repeated beneficiaries, similar medical histories, small inconsistencies in documentation that nobody notices individually but become suspicious when connected together. That was my specialty, finding connections nobody else saw. Ironically, the exact survival skill I developed growing up around my father made me exceptionally good at exposing dishonest people professionally. About 8 months into the job, my department launched a major internal audit involving suspicious death benefit claims across several states. Millions of dollars were potentially involved. The company believed an organized fraud network had been exploiting policy loopholes using fake medical records, manipulated identities, and falsified next-of-kin documentation. Federal investigators were already quietly involved, but only a handful of executives knew that at the time. My team received thousands of digital records to review, and most of the work was repetitive. Cross-check signatures, compare timelines, verify beneficiary consistency. But one evening around 9:30, while reviewing archived policy modifications, I noticed something strange. One beneficiary name appeared repeatedly across unrelated claims connected to completely different policyholders. Richard Harper, my father's name. At first, I assumed it had to be coincidence because Richard Harper isn't exactly rare. But then I saw an address connected to one of the claims: South Victor Avenue, Tulsa, Oklahoma, my childhood home. I remember physically freezing in my office chair while staring at the screen because suddenly every instinct in my body started screaming at me that something was horribly wrong. I opened additional records connected to the name and immediately noticed statistical anomalies everywhere. Policies increased shortly before sudden deaths, beneficiary changes filed under suspicious circumstances, inconsistent witness signatures, delayed medical reporting, and then I found the document that made my stomach drop so hard I genuinely thought I might throw up right there at my desk. My own life insurance policy from 2010. The same one my father secretly took out on me when I was 18, except the file contained details I had never known before. He had attempted to increase the payout to $1 million less than 2 weeks before my kidneys failed. Worse than that, attached investigator notes showed concern about unusually aggressive inquiries from the beneficiary regarding payout processing during my hospitalization. My father had literally been monitored by the insurance company 16 years earlier because his behavior looked suspicious even back then. I sat there staring at the screen trying to process the realization that my father may not have simply hoped I would die. He may have actively prepared for it financially. That distinction changed everything. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand something important. Actuarial fraud investigations don't move emotionally. They move mathematically. And the deeper I dug into the numbers, the uglier the pattern became. Over the next 3 weeks, I secretly reviewed every connected file I could legally access through the investigation. The fraud network appeared to target vulnerable people with severe illnesses, addiction problems, or unstable family situations. Policies would be opened or expanded shortly before suspicious deaths occurred. Then payouts would funnel through layered beneficiaries and shell businesses before disappearing. Some claims looked technically legal on paper, which made prosecution difficult. But the statistical probability of so many coincidences happening repeatedly was nearly impossible. Then I discovered something that connected my father directly to the operation beyond any doubt. A storage facility rental agreement signed under an alias but linked to his driver's license records through payment metadata. Inside investigator photographs from a prior warrant search were stacks of forged documents, fake medical records, and partially completed insurance applications. One photo showed a yellow folder labeled EH, my initials. That was the moment this stopped being a professional investigation for me emotionally, because suddenly I realized my father hadn't just committed fraud generally. He had built part of his system using experience he learned while planning around my illness years earlier. I barely slept after that discovery. Every memory from my childhood started replaying differently inside my head. The paperwork, the hospital conversations, his obsession with payout questions. Even his lack of emotion after I recovered suddenly looked terrifying instead of cold. It looked disappointed. A few days later, federal investigators officially joined our internal review team in person. One of them, Special Agent Marcus Hill, requested a private conversation with me after noticing how intensely I had been analyzing the Harper-linked claims. At first, I tried keeping things professional, but eventually I told him the truth. Richard Harper was my father. I expected shock. Instead, he looked almost relieved. Then he opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table toward me. It showed my father standing beside 2 men outside a casino in Oklahoma 3 years earlier. One of those men was already under federal indictment for organized financial fraud. Agent Hill calmly explained that investigators had been tracking a regional insurance scam for nearly 4 years, but they struggled proving who coordinated beneficiary routing and policy manipulation behind the scenes. Until now. Then he said something that completely changed the direction of my life again. He said, "Your father may be responsible for more deaths than anyone realizes." and suddenly my childhood stopped feeling tragic. It started feeling dangerous. For almost 2 weeks after my meeting with Agent Marcus Hill, I lived in a state that barely felt real. I would wake up at 3 in the morning, replaying conversations from my childhood over and over again, trying to decide whether my father had always been this dangerous, or whether greed slowly transformed him into someone capable of treating human lives like financial opportunities. The hardest part wasn't discovering the fraud itself. It was realizing how naturally he fit into it. Nothing about the investigation felt inconsistent with the man I grew up around. The manipulation, the obsession with money, the way he viewed relationships transactionally. Even his favoritism toward Caleb suddenly made sense in a twisted way. My father valued people based on what they could provide him emotionally, financially, or socially. Once someone stopped being useful, he emotionally detached from them almost instantly. Looking back, I think part of him emotionally buried me the moment I got sick, because in his mind I had become expensive, unpredictable, and difficult to profit from long term. Agent Hill eventually brought me into a restricted investigative briefing alongside 2 federal analysts and Midwestern Mutual's legal director. That meeting changed everything because for the first time I saw the full scale of what investigators believed my father's network had done. The fraud operation stretched across at least 4 states and involved staged beneficiary transfers, forged medical records, manipulated policy upgrades, and suspicious deaths connected to financially vulnerable families. Several cases involved terminally ill individuals whose policies had suddenly increased in value shortly before fatal overdoses, accidents, or delayed emergency reporting. The evidence wasn't fully conclusive yet, but statistically, the patterns were horrifying. One analyst explained that normal accidental death distributions don't cluster around policy modification windows the way these cases did. In simple terms, too many people died conveniently right after coverage increased. Then Agent Hill showed me something I wasn't prepared for. A spreadsheet containing internal payout estimates connected to pending claims recovered from my father's storage unit. One line contained my name, Evelyn Harper, estimated payout, $1 million. Notes beside the entry read, kidney complications likely, monitor timeline. I genuinely couldn't breathe for a few seconds after seeing it. There it was in black and white. My father had essentially created a financial projection for my possible death while I was still a teenager fighting a severe illness. Not grief, not concern, a payout projection. I remember asking Agent Hill whether they believed my father actually intended to physically harm policyholders or whether he simply exploited situations after people became sick. The room went quiet for a moment before he answered carefully. He said investigators believed some deaths were opportunistic, but others showed signs of deliberate neglect, delayed intervention, or manipulated medication access through connected individuals. Hearing that made my skin crawl because suddenly one memory from the hospital resurfaced with terrifying clarity. During my ICU stay, one of my medications had been temporarily misplaced before a nurse corrected the issue during a shift change. At the time, everyone assumed it was an administrative mistake. Now I wasn't sure anymore. That uncertainty became the most disturbing part of the investigation. I could never fully prove whether my father merely expected me to die or quietly helped circumstances move in that direction. But honestly, I'm not sure which possibility is worse. Over the next month, I worked closely with investigators, building actuarial probability models connecting the fraudulent claims. That's when my role shifted from employee to essential witness. My analysis identified hidden financial relationships investigators had completely missed. Multiple payout accounts eventually funneled money through small shell companies connected to casino debt settlements and vehicle financing groups tied back to my father's business contacts in Tulsa. The deeper we dug, the more sophisticated the operation appeared. This wasn't some desperate man committing random fraud. It was a carefully structured system built over years by people who understood exactly how insurance investigations worked and how to avoid triggering immediate suspicion. One evening after work, Agent Hill asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. He asked whether I planned to testify publicly if indictments moved forward. I immediately said yes, before really thinking about it. Then he warned me that once arrests happened, the media attention would become brutal. My father's attorneys would likely attack my credibility, my family history, my motives, even my illness. They would paint me as an emotionally unstable daughter trying to punish her father over childhood resentment. And honestly, part of me knew that narrative would sound believable to strangers because family betrayal stories always become messy once lawyers get involved. But then Agent Hill said something that settled the decision permanently for me. He said, "You're not valuable because you're his daughter. You're valuable because your analysis exposed the structure nobody else could fully see." That mattered more to me than he probably realized because growing up in my father's house taught me to associate worth with usefulness. For the first time in my life, someone valued my mind instead of what they could gain from me. Around the same time, my mother suddenly called me after nearly 4 months of silence. Her voice sounded terrified. She told me federal agents had visited the house earlier that day asking questions about insurance documents and financial records. Then she whispered something that made my blood run cold. She said my father had started burning paperwork in the backyard the night before. Burning paperwork, which meant he knew the walls were closing in. But before I could ask more questions, my mother said something even worse. She quietly told me Caleb had disappeared 3 days earlier after losing a massive amount of money gambling in Las Vegas. And according to her, my father was convinced Caleb's debt problems were about to expose everything. The moment my mother told me Caleb had disappeared, I knew the investigation was about to become unstable. Fraud networks survive because everyone involved believes silence protects them more than honesty does. But once money starts collapsing and people panic, loyalty disappears fast. Caleb had spent most of his life being protected from consequences by my father, which made him exactly the kind of person investigators eventually flip under pressure. 3 days after that phone call, Agent Hill confirmed my suspicion. Caleb had been located at a casino hotel outside Reno after trying to cash out chips using falsified financial documentation tied to one of the shell companies under investigation. Federal agents detained him for questioning, and within hours he started talking. A lot. Apparently, years of gambling debt had turned him into one of my father's money couriers, without him fully understanding the scale of the operation initially. At first, he believed he was simply helping move money through tax-safe accounts connected to vehicle financing businesses. Then he realized payouts from suspicious death claims were being routed through those same accounts. By then, he already owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to casino lenders and private debt collectors, so walking away became almost impossible. According to investigators, Caleb eventually helped transport fraudulent policy paperwork, fake beneficiary forms, and cash payments between Oklahoma, Missouri, and Texas. Hearing all of that should have made me furious, but honestly, the emotion I felt most was sadness. Caleb had spent his entire life trying to become the version of success my father demanded, and when he failed athletically, my father simply repurposed him into something else useful. That's the terrifying thing about manipulative parents. They don't stop controlling people when childhood ends. They just change methods. A week later, the first major arrests happened. 6 individuals connected to the fraud network were taken into custody across 3 states, including 2 medical records coordinators accused of altering patient files connected to policy applications. But my father wasn't arrested immediately. Investigators believed he was trying to destroy evidence and possibly move money offshore through gambling networks, so they monitored him instead, hoping he would lead them to additional accounts. Meanwhile, the company placed me on temporary protected leave because media rumors about the investigation had already started leaking publicly. That's when my life became surreal. News outlets began reporting on a multi-state insurance fraud conspiracy involving suspicious death benefit claims, but they didn't know my connection yet. Then one local Oklahoma reporter uncovered public records linking Richard Harper to me. Within 24 hours, reporters started contacting my office, my apartment building, even old classmates from high school. Suddenly, strangers online were debating whether I was a whistleblower hero or a bitter daughter exploiting family tragedy for attention. Some comments were unbelievably cruel. People accused me of fabricating accusations for revenge over inheritance disputes that didn't even exist. Others defended my father simply because they couldn't emotionally process the idea that a parent might treat their child like a financial asset. I tried pretending the public attention didn't bother me, but it did, especially because part of me still struggled with guilt despite everything. Trauma does that to people. Even after years of mistreatment, some part of you keeps searching for explanations that make the people you loved seem less monstrous than reality suggests. Then everything changed again 3 weeks later when investigators recovered deleted financial records from a laptop seized during one of the raids. Inside encrypted spreadsheets were payout projections tied to specific policyholders, including notations about medical vulnerabilities, addiction histories, and probability windows. But one file stood out from all the others because it wasn't just financial. It was personal. The file was labeled EH and contained detailed notes about my illness from 2010, including hospital schedules, medication complications, estimated survival probabilities, and handwritten comments investigators later matched to my father's writing samples. I still remember the exact sentence that nearly made me physically sick when Agent Hill showed me the evidence. Beside one projected payout estimate my father had written, "If condition worsens naturally, avoid interference." Avoid interference, not help her recover, not support treatment. Avoid interference, like my survival had become an inconvenience to financial planning. That sentence destroyed the last emotional defense I still carried for him because it confirmed something horrifying. My father may not have directly tried to kill me, but he absolutely viewed my possible death as an opportunity worth protecting. A few days later, prosecutors officially announced federal conspiracy charges against 14 individuals connected to the operation, and my father's name finally became public. I watched the announcement alone in my apartment while reporters crowded outside the federal courthouse on television screens. Then they showed him being escorted into the building, wearing a dark suit and handcuffs. For a second, he looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. But then he looked directly toward the cameras with the exact same expression he used whenever he blamed other people for his mistakes growing up. Calm, controlled, certain he could manipulate his way out of consequences. That expression vanished the next morning. Because overnight, Caleb officially agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, and according to his testimony, my father had privately referred to me for years as the policy that failed. When I heard the phrase, the policy that failed, I stopped seeing my father as a damaged human being and started seeing him exactly the way he had always seen everyone else, as a calculation. Up until that moment, some emotional part of me still wanted an explanation that would make all of this less horrifying. Addiction, desperation, financial collapse, anything. But people don't accidentally refer to their daughter as a failed insurance policy for 16 years. That kind of thinking is built deep into someone long before they ever get caught. Caleb's cooperation completely changed the federal case because suddenly investigators weren't relying only on financial patterns and circumstantial evidence anymore. They now had an insider describing how the operation actually worked from the inside. According to Caleb's testimony, My father specialized in identifying financially vulnerable families through dealership clients, gambling contacts, and medical debt referrals. He would encourage people to expand insurance policies on sick relatives while quietly coaching them on how to structure paperwork to avoid triggering internal reviews. In some cases, beneficiaries were switched shortly before deaths occurred. In others, policies were layered through shell entities tied to fake business partnerships. But the most disturbing detail involved what my father called passive acceleration. That was his term for situations where vulnerable people were left without timely medical support, proper medication access, or emergency intervention because family members financially benefited more from death than recovery. Hearing that term during the briefing made me physically nauseous because suddenly the memory of my ICU medication mistake stopped feeling abstract. I asked Agent Hill directly whether investigators believed my father intentionally interfered with my treatment back in 2010. He answered carefully, which honestly told me more than words would have. He said there wasn't enough evidence to prove criminal intent regarding my hospitalization specifically, but there were deeply concerning patterns surrounding his behavior during that period. Legally, that wasn't enough for attempted murder charges. Emotionally, it was enough for me. The federal trial began in March 2026 and immediately became a media circus. National outlets picked up the story because the idea of an actuary helping expose her own father's insurance fraud network sounded almost fictional. Every news segment framed it differently. Some called it a story about corruption and greed. Others focused on family betrayal. One headline literally described me as the daughter who calculated her father's lies. I hated that one. Not because it was inaccurate, but because it reduced years of trauma into something catchy for strangers to consume during lunch breaks. Testifying turned out to be harder than I expected, not because I doubted the evidence, but because seeing my father again after 16 years felt psychologically disorienting. He looked older, heavier, more tired around the eyes, but the core of him hadn't changed at all. When I walked into the courtroom, he didn't look ashamed. He looked annoyed, like my existence was still inconveniencing him. Prosecutors spent days presenting actuarial probability models, payout records, forged documentation, and financial transfers connected to the fraud network. Then Caleb testified. I honestly think that was the moment the jury emotionally turned against my father completely. Caleb admitted under oath that our father openly discussed vulnerable people in terms of financial risk exposure instead of humanity. He described overhearing conversations where policyholders were referred to as strong payouts or bad investments. But the courtroom went completely silent when prosecutors asked whether my father ever spoke that way about family members. Caleb hesitated for several seconds before quietly saying yes. Then he repeated the phrase, "The policy that failed." I didn't look at my father after that because I genuinely didn't trust myself emotionally. Years of suppressed anger, grief, confusion, and humiliation all collided inside me at once. But the worst moment came 2 days later when prosecutors introduced the handwritten notes recovered from the EH file connected to my illness. My father's attorney tried arguing the notes were misunderstood financial planning documents, but then prosecutors displayed one specific sentence on the courtroom monitors for everyone to read. If condition worsens naturally, avoid interference. I watched jurors physically react to that sentence in real time. One woman covered her mouth. Another juror shook his head slowly while staring directly at my father. For the first time since the trial started, he actually looked nervous. Then it was my turn to testify. People always imagine courtroom speeches as dramatic movie moments, but honestly, my testimony felt strangely calm once I started talking. I explained actuarial fraud modeling, probability clustering, risk analysis, beneficiary manipulation patterns. Then prosecutors asked me when I first realized the investigation connected personally to my family. I told them about opening my old policy file late at night in my office and seeing evidence that my father had monitored payout structures while I was hospitalized at 18 years old. Finally, the prosecutor asked the question everyone in the courtroom was waiting for. He asked, "Ms. Harper, based on your professional analysis and your review of the evidence, what conclusion did you personally reach about your father's intentions regarding your illness?" The courtroom became completely silent. I looked directly at my father for the first time since entering the building and realized something shocking. He genuinely didn't think he had done anything unforgivable. Even now, even after all the evidence, all the victims, all the destroyed families, in his mind, this was still about bad luck and financial opportunity, not morality. So I answered honestly. I said, "I believe my father saw my possible death as more valuable than my survival." My father finally reacted emotionally after hearing that. He stood up suddenly, pointed at me, and shouted, "You were supposed to understand sacrifice." The entire courtroom froze. Even his own attorneys looked stunned because in one uncontrolled sentence he accidentally revealed more truth than prosecutors had managed to extract for months. Not grief, not denial, sacrifice. Like my existence had always been negotiable compared to what he believed the family needed financially. Court officers immediately forced him back into his seat, while reporters practically exploded out of the courtroom trying to file updates. And sitting there staring at him, I realized something painful but freeing at the same time. My father never actually loved people individually. He loved what they represented to him: potential, status, money, security, control. The moment someone stopped providing those things, he emotionally converted them into liabilities. And 16 years earlier, when I got sick, I became one. The verdict came 4 days later after less than 6 hours of jury deliberation, which, according to several attorneys covering the case, was incredibly fast considering the scale of the investigation. My father was convicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, wire fraud, financial laundering, falsification of beneficiary records, and obstruction of a federal investigation. 2 additional charges connected to negligent death facilitation remained legally complicated because prosecutors still couldn't definitively prove direct physical involvement in certain deaths. But honestly, the courtroom barely reacted to those details by that point. The emotional damage had already been done long before the final verdict was read. People weren't looking at Richard Harper as a businessman who crossed legal lines anymore. They were looking at a man who calculated human worth through payout structures and probability models, including his own daughters. When the judge announced the sentence, my father barely reacted outwardly. 27 years in federal prison, financial asset seizure, permanent restitution obligations tied to fraudulent payouts. Most of the money was already gone through gambling losses, shell accounts, and frozen investigations. But the symbolic destruction of everything he built mattered almost more than the prison time itself. Because men like my father survive psychologically through control, status, and manipulation. Losing all 3 publicly was the one punishment he genuinely feared. Caleb received a reduced sentence deal because of his cooperation, although reduced still meant several years under supervised federal custody and financial monitoring. The strangest part of the entire aftermath was my mother. During the trial, she looked like someone emotionally trapped between grief and relief at the same time. After the sentencing, she approached me outside the courthouse while reporters shouted questions from behind barricades. For a second, I thought she was going to apologize for everything that happened growing up, for staying silent, for letting my father emotionally destroy our family piece by piece, while pretending stability mattered more than truth. Instead, she quietly asked me something far sadder. She asked, "Do you think he ever loved any of us?" I honestly didn't know how to answer her because the question itself was tragic. Imagine spending decades married to someone and only realizing after federal investigators arrive that you never fully understood who they were. I eventually told her something that may sound cruel, but was probably the most honest thing I could say. I said, "I think he loved ownership more than connection." She cried after hearing that because deep down, I think she already knew it was true. After the trial ended, my life became strangely quiet very quickly. Media attention faded within a few months because the world always moves on to newer scandals eventually. Documentaries were discussed, but never finalized. Podcasts covered the case for a while, then disappeared beneath newer tragedies and public obsessions. But my personal life changed permanently in ways nobody on television could really understand. For months after the verdict, I struggled with intense guilt anytime something good happened to me. That sounds irrational after everything my father did, but children raised in manipulative households often associate personal success with betrayal. Every promotion, every compliment, every peaceful moment carried this strange emotional instinct that I was somehow abandoning people who hurt me. Therapy helped eventually. So did distance. So did learning that surviving toxic families sometimes means accepting that closure isn't a magical emotional breakthrough. Sometimes closure is simply refusing to carry their version of you anymore. About a year after the trial, Midwestern Mutual offered me a leadership position overseeing advanced fraud analytics for complex claims investigations. The irony wasn't lost on me. The sick 18-year-old girl whose father once viewed her as a potential payout had become one of the people responsible for preventing financial predators from exploiting vulnerable families exactly the way he did. Some nights that still feels surreal. I bought a small house outside Chicago shortly after accepting the position. Nothing extravagant, just quiet, peaceful, mine. The first thing I did after moving in was replace every lock myself, which my therapist later pointed out was probably symbolic in ways I hadn't fully realized yet. My mother occasionally calls now, though our relationship remains complicated. Caleb wrote me 3 letters from federal custody before I finally responded to one. The strangest thing about his letters was how ordinary they sounded. Regret about wasted years, shame, fear. It reminded me that people shaped by toxic families often become damaged long before they become guilty. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains some of it. As for my father, I haven't spoken to him since the trial. About 8 months after sentencing, his attorney contacted me asking whether I would consider a private reconciliation meeting. Apparently, prison psychologists believed unresolved family conflict contributed heavily to his deteriorating mental state. I declined immediately, not out of revenge, not even out of anger anymore, just clarity. Some relationships become too contaminated by manipulation to rebuild safely. And one of the hardest lessons I ever learned is that forgiveness and access are not the same thing. You can stop hating someone without reopening the door for them to hurt you again. Sometimes the healthiest boundary is permanent distance. Looking back now, I think the most disturbing part of this entire story isn't the fraud itself or even the trial. It's how easily greed disguised itself as normal family behavior for so many years. Favoritism, financial manipulation, conditional love, emotional neglect. Those things become dangerous gradually because children adapt to unhealthy environments long before they understand them. If there's one thing I want people listening to this story to remember, it's this. When someone consistently treats your existence like a transaction, believe them early. Love does not calculate your worth based on usefulness. Real love does not quietly prepare for your failure. And real family never sees your survival as a financial inconvenience.